History does not always announce itself with explosions and headlines. Sometimes the most consequential moments in history arrive wearing the disguise of their opposite. A peace deal is being celebrated in the press. Diplomats are shaking hands, the cameras are rolling, the statements are being read. And every serious analyst who understands how power actually operates, not how politicians describe it operating, but how the structural forces of interest, capability, and strategic positioning actually shape outcomes, is watching this ceremony with a specific and deeply uncomfortable recognition. This peace deal is not the end of the conflict. This peace deal is the opening move of the next phase of the conflict. And there's going to be significantly more dangerous than the phase that just ended. Let me explain why, because the structural analysis here is not ambiguous, even if the mainstream coverage is determined to treat what is happening as a conclusion rather than a transition. 3 questions will organize everything that follows. First, what are the specific structural features of this peace agreement that reveal its function as a strategic pause rather than a genuine resolution? Second, which actor benefits most from the pause, and why does that benefit create overwhelming incentive for renewed conflict when the pause ends? And third, what specific triggers will we observe when the war that starts tomorrow begins? And what will it look like different from the war that the peace deal just temporarily halted? By the end of this analysis, you will understand something that the diplomatic community is either unwilling to admit or genuinely incapable of perceiving. The structural forces that produce this conflict have not been addressed by this agreement. They have been paused. Pauses in unresolved conflicts serve the party that uses the pause most effectively, and the evidence is unambiguous about which party that is. Here is what you need to understand about how peace deals function in the real world of strategic competition, as opposed to the idealized world of diplomatic theory. A peace deal is an agreement between parties who have each concluded that continued conflict no longer serves their interests better than a pause. This is not more progressive. This is rational calculation. When one party concludes that a pause serves its interests better than continued fighting, it signs. When both parties reach that conclusion simultaneously, a deal becomes possible. But here's the critical insight that explains why so many peace agreements fail to produce actual peace. The calculation that led each party to sign the deal was made on the basis of their strategic situation at the moment of signing. The moment a party's strategic situation improves through rearmament, economic recovery, diplomatic realignment, or simply the passage of time that allows forces to reconstitute, the calculation that produced the agreement changes. And when the calculation changes, the behavior changes. The agreement does not change the structural interests that produced the conflict. It only temporarily aligns the short-term interests of the parties in a way that makes fighting less rational than pausing. The moment that alignment shifts, the agreement becomes paper. Let us examine the specific structural features of this agreement that reveal its true character. The first structural tell is what the agreement does not address. Every genuine conflict resolution requires, at minimum, an agreed framework for addressing the underlying incompatibility that produced the conflict. Whether that incompatibility is territorial, political, economic, or ethnic, a real peace requires either a resolution of the incompatibility or an agreed mechanism for managing it that both parties accept as legitimate and sustainable. What this agreement provides is a ceasefire line, a prisoner exchange framework, and a set of diplomatic commitments that are neither verifiable nor enforceable through any mechanism both parties accept. The underlying incompatibility, which we will examine in specific terms shortly, remains entirely unaddressed. This is not an oversight. This is the price of getting both parties to sign. The concessions required to actually resolve the underlying incompatibility were greater than either party was willing to make under current strategic conditions. So both parties signed an agreement that they know does not resolve the conflict because signing was better than continuing to fight right now, and because both parties intend to pursue the unresolved incompatibility through other means once the strategic conditions improve. The second structural tell is the timeline provisions buried in the agreement's technical annexes. These provisions deserve specific attention because they reveal the strategic logic of the party that insisted on their inclusion. When agreements contain specific timelines for forced reconstitution limits, monitoring mechanisms that expire after fixed periods, or inspection protocols that can be blocked by either party's sovereignty invocations, they contain within themselves the structural conditions for their own violation. Agreements that cannot be enforced are not agreements. They are statements of temporary intent, and temporary intent changes when the circumstances that produced it change. The timeline provisions in this agreement create a window, a specific calculable window, within which the reconstitution of military capability that the agreement nominally limits can occur without triggering the agreement's own violation clauses. That window is not an accident of drafting. It is the mechanism through which the strategic pause is converted back into strategic advantage at the appropriate moment. Now let me examine which party benefits most from the pause and why. This is the analytical question that mainstream coverage refuses to engage directly because the honest answer requires acknowledging something that diplomatic convention finds impolite. Pauses in conflict benefit the party that is most capable of using the pause to change the strategic conditions that produce the current military balance. If Party A is currently losing, or has fought to a stalemate that does not reflect its actual strategic potential, a pause gives Party A time to reconstitute, rearm, reposition, and realign in ways that improve its relative position when conflict resumes. If Party B is currently winning Sauron or has achieved a military position that gives it leverage it cannot convert into permanent political gains without significant additional cost, when chance is a pause also potentially benefits Party B if the political and economic costs of continued military operations exceed the value of the military position it currently holds. Both parties signed, but the party that benefits more from the pause is the party whose strategic position improves more during the pause relative to its adversary. And structural analysis of the military situation at the time of signing points unambiguously to which party that is. Here is what you need to understand about the reconstitution dynamic that will unfold during this pause. Military equipment destroyed in conflict must be replaced. Trained military personnel killed or captured must be replaced. Logistics networks disrupted by combat operations must be rebuilt. Economic infrastructure damaged by the conflict must be repaired. All of these reconstitution activities take time, resources, and external support. The party that has access to more external support from allies, from arms suppliers, from economic partners willing to absorb the costs of conflict will reconstitute more rapidly and more completely than the party that relies primarily on its own resources. This is not speculation. This is the deterministic logic of military economics. The question of which party reconstitutes more effectively during the pause is a question of which party has stronger external support networks. And the answer to that question has been visible in the diplomatic alignment surrounding this conflict from its earliest stages. Let us examine the historical analogies that make this pattern recognizable rather than novel. The armistice that ended World War I in November 1918 was a genuine ceasefire in the sense that both parties stopped shooting. It was not a genuine peace in the sense that the underlying incompatibilities that had produced the war, the territorial ambitions, the alliance obligations, the economic rivalries, the unresolved questions of national self-determination, remained entirely unresolved. The Versailles Treaty that followed did not resolve these incompatibilities. It imposed a settlement on the losing party that the losing party experienced as humiliation, and that created structural conditions for renewed conflict 21 years later. The mechanism was not complicated. The losing party used the interwar period to reconstitute its economic and military capability, while the winning parties, exhausted by the costs of victory, reduced their own military establishments and retreated into domestic preoccupations. When the losing party's reconstitution was sufficiently advanced, the conflict resumed with dramatically higher intensity and dramatically higher costs. The Korean Armistice of 1953 provides a different but equally instructive pattern. The Korean Armistice stopped the fighting along a line that both parties found acceptable given their military situations at that moment. It did not resolve the underlying incompatibility, the question of which Korean government represents the legitimate authority over the peninsula that produced the conflict. 70 years later, that incompatibility remains unresolved. The armistice persists because both parties have consistently concluded that the costs of resuming conflict exceed the benefits of the unresolved incompatibility's resolution through force. But this persistent calculation of mutual deterrence is not a permanent structural condition. It is a repeated calculation that both parties make continuously, and it continues to produce armistice behavior only as long as both parties' calculations align. The moment one party's calculation changes, because its military capability improves relative to the adversary, or because the cost of the status quo exceeds the cost of conflict, the armistice becomes vulnerable. The peace deal we are examining today resembles neither of these historical patterns precisely. What it most resembles is the series of ceasefires in protracted conflicts, where the ceasefire is used by one party as a strategic tool for repositioning rather than as a genuine attempt at resolution. The Oslo Accords of 1993 created a framework that both parties signed, but that neither party implemented in the spirit its architects intended, because the underlying incompatibility of competing territorial and sovereignty claims remained unresolved, and because the structural incentives for each party to exploit the framework's ambiguities exceeded the incentives for strict compliance. The Minsk agreements signed in 2014 and 2015 regarding the conflict in eastern Ukraine created a ceasefire framework that neither party implemented because both parties used the ceasefire period to improve their military positions in preparation for resumed conflict. These are not anomalies. These are the normal behavior of rational actors in unresolved conflicts who conclude that a pause serves their interests better than continued fighting right now. Now let us examine the specific triggers that will signal when the real war begins, because the structural analysis is not merely diagnostic, it is predictive, and the predictions here are specific enough to be testable. Trigger 1, the monitoring mechanism breaks down. Every ceasefire agreement contains provisions for monitoring compliance. When one party begins systematically obstructing the monitoring mechanism, blocking observer access, refusing inspection requests, expelling monitoring personnel on technical violations, that obstruction signals that the party has begun activities it does not want monitored. The specific form of the obstruction tells you what the party does not want seen. Obstruction of aerial monitoring suggests force reconstitution in areas that aerial observation would reveal. Obstruction of ground-level inspection suggests weapons movement or fortification construction that ground inspection would document. Watch for the monitoring obstruction. It will precede the next military action by approximately 60 to 90 days. Trigger 2. The diplomatic temperature drops before the military temperature rises. Before conflict resumes, the political communications between the parties shift. The tone of official statements becomes more accusatory. References to the adversary's bad faith in implementing the agreement become more frequent. Public statements by military officials emphasize threats rather than stability. This rhetorical escalation serves the domestic political function of preparing populations for resumed conflict while providing the legal pretext for treating the adversary's conduct as having voided the agreement's obligations. When you observe this pattern in the official communications, you are observing the pre-conflict signaling sequence that has preceded every resumption of paused conflict in the historical record. Trigger 3. Third-party weapons deliveries accelerate. The external supporters who provided weapons during the conflict do not stop their supply relationships during the ceasefire. They adapt them. Weapons deliveries that would have been visible during active conflict become less visible during a ceasefire because the operational urgency that makes rapid delivery necessary is replaced by the quieter reconstitution logic that favors steady accumulation over emergency shipment. But the accumulation is observable through shipping records, export licenses, and the intelligence channels that track these movements. When those channels show accelerating accumulation of specific weapons categories, air defense systems, precision munitions, armored vehicles, in the month before conflict resumes, the timing of that accumulation was not coincidental. The scenario predictions for when the real war starts tomorrow are therefore specific. Within 6 to 12 months of the agreement's signing, the monitoring mechanism will experience its first significant breakdown. Within 9 to 15 months, the rhetorical temperature will have escalated to the point where both parties are publicly accusing the other of material violations. Within 12 to 18 months, a specific incident, a border violation, a weapons transfer interdiction, an assassination, A commercial infrastructure attack will provide the immediate pretext for military action that both parties will have been preparing for during the entirety of the pause. The incident will be presented as a response to provocation. The structural analysis shows it was the predictable outcome of a peace deal that never addressed the incompatibility that produced the conflict. Here is the synthesis. Peace deals are not inherently dishonest. Some peace deals resolve conflicts because the underlying incompatibilities are resolved, or because both parties genuinely conclude that the costs of any future conflict exceed the value of the issue in dispute. Those deals hold. The deal we are examining today is not that kind of deal. It is a strategic pause masquerading as a resolution. The structural evidence is in the provisions that are absent, in the timeline mechanisms that create reconstitution windows, in the diplomatic alignments that tell us which party has stronger reconstitution support, and in the historical patterns that show us how this story ends. I might be wrong about the timeline. I might be wrong about the specific trigger event. What structural analysis does not permit is the comfortable conclusion that a signed agreement represents a resolved conflict when the incompatibility that produced the conflict remains structurally intact. History does not forgive those who mistake temporary silence for permanent peace. We will be watching these developments closely, tracking each indicator against the framework established today. The real war starts not with a dramatic announcement. It starts with the quiet accumulation of conditions that make continued peace less rational than resumed conflict. We are already watching that accumulation begin. The information environment surrounding the peace deal deserves specific analytical attention because it tells you something important about each party's strategic intentions that the formal diplomatic language deliberately obscures. When parties to an agreement invest in controlling the information narrative around that agreement, they are telling you something about the discrepancy between the deal they signed and the strategy they are pursuing. Specifically, the party that emphasizes the deal's historic significance, that invests in ceremony and international witness, and that publicizes the agreement's provisions most loudly, is typically the party that benefits from the legitimacy the agreement provides rather than from the military or political conditions it creates on the ground. Legitimacy is valuable when you need international cover for what you are actually doing. The party that needs international cover the most is typically the party whose subsequent actions would otherwise attract international condemnation. Read the public information behavior around this agreement, and you have a guide to which party most needs the agreement to appear as a genuine resolution rather than a strategic pause. The role of third-party guarantors reveals another structural dimension. Peace agreements that require third-party guarantors to be credible are agreements that neither signatory believes the other will honor voluntarily. The guarantor's role is to create costs for violation that the agreement itself cannot create. But guarantors have their own interests, their own strategic attention limitations, and their own domestic political constraints that make sustained engagement with any specific agreement difficult to maintain across the years or decades that an unresolved conflict can endure. American guarantees of the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt required sustained American diplomatic attention, financial support to both parties, and repeated crisis management over 4 decades to maintain. The Oslo process collapsed in part because the American guarantor lost the sustained strategic attention and the domestic political will to maintain the pressure on both parties that implementation required. Third-party guarantors are not structural solutions to unresolved conflicts. They are maintenance mechanisms for managed stalemates, and managed stalemates eventually end, one way or another. The economic dimensions of the pause deserve examination because economic interests are among the most reliable predictors of whether a ceasefire framework holds or collapses. When the economic costs of resumed conflict are sufficiently high for both parties, and when those economic costs fall on constituencies within each party's political coalition that have the influence to prevent political leadership from resuming hostilities, economic interests create structural supports for ceasefire maintenance that diplomatic commitments alone cannot provide. The question to ask about any specific peace deal is whether the economic interests of relevant domestic constituencies within each party align with ceasefire maintenance or with resumed conflict. When the constituencies that profit from conflict, defense industries, ideological movements, regional actors with interests in instability, are more politically influential than the constituencies that profit from peace, the structural pressure is toward resumed conflict regardless of what the agreement says. Examine the specific economic provisions of the agreement under analysis. If reconstruction aid flows are structured to benefit the party that resumes conflict more than the party that maintains the ceasefire, Geopolitical harsiu dekrar therefore aussius der axuar arxes. Incentives embedded in the agreement's own provisions point toward resumed hostilities. If sanctions relief is front-loaded, delivered before performance benchmarks are met, rather than conditioned on verified compliance with the agreement's terms, the party receiving front-loaded economic benefits has already extracted the economic value of the agreement before it has any reason to honor its military provisions. Front-loaded economic concessions in exchange for backloaded military compliance commitments is the structural architecture of an agreement designed to be exploited rather than implemented. These details are in the technical annexes that journalists do not read and that the public ceremony deliberately obscures. The regional dynamics that frame any bilateral peace deal, without being party to it, are the final analytical dimension that responsible analysis cannot ignore. No conflict in the modern international system exists in true bilateral isolation. Every conflict has neighbors, regional organizations, great power patrons, and ideological allies whose interests are affected by the conflict's outcome and who have both the motive and the capability to influence whether a ceasefire holds. The question to ask about any peace deal is not only whether the two signatories have incentives to honor it. The question is whether the third parties whose interests are affected by the agreement's implementation have incentives to support it or to undermine it. Third parties with interests in resumed conflict because the conflict serves their strategic objectives, weakens their adversaries, or provides them with influence they lose when the conflict ends. Structural threats to any ceasefire framework, regardless of how carefully the bilateral provisions are drafted. Identify the third parties, analyze their interests, and you have the most reliable predictor of whether the agreement survives its first 18 months. What responsible analysis must ultimately acknowledge is that peace deals, however imperfect, create some probability of outcomes better than resumed conflict even when they do not resolve underlying incompatibilities. The probabilistic comparison is not between the imperfect peace deal and an ideal resolution. The probabilistic comparison is between the imperfect peace deal and resumed conflict with all of its costs, casualties, and unpredictable escalation dynamics. Even a strategic pause that serves one party's interests more than the others is preferable to a conflict whose next phase could exceed the previous phase in destructiveness. This acknowledgement does not require abandoning the structural analysis that identifies the deal's limitations. It requires holding both truths simultaneously. The deal is a trap in the sense that it does not resolve the underlying incompatibility, and the deal is also a period of reduced violence that may be extended if the parties' calculations continue to align with the pause rather than with resumed hostilities. The trap does not spring automatically. It springs when the strategic conditions that produce the agreement change sufficiently that one party's calculation shifts. Our role as analysts is to track those conditions and identify when the shift is approaching so that the choices available to prevent resumed conflict can be exercised before the trap springs rather than after. We will continue to watch these developments through Xueqi framework established today.